Well, good afternoon, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be with you today, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my research with you. Let me briefly introduce myself. I received my bachelor's degree in engineering from the University of Singapore and my PhD in business administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And for many years, I was a Regents Professor at Oklahoma State University, and then later on, Chair Professor of Management Science at the City University of Hong Kong. After I retired, I devoted all my time to studying Chinese history and literature. And that explains why I'm standing over here, because you're wondering why is a business professor talking about Chinese history. I retired 9 years ago, and in the past 9 years, I've been doing a full-time job of researching in Chinese history. I do this as my retirement hobby. I want to mention explicitly that I don't get any money for doing this. Whenever I get invitations, the inviting organizations have always been very kind to offer to pay for my airfare and my hotel bills, and I've always insisted that I do not receive any payment. I pay for my own airfare, I pay for my own hotel. The only thing I'll accept would be free meals. Okay, if you give me a free lunch, I accept it. Okay, but I pay for my own airfare, I pay for my own hotel bills, and the reason is very important. I'm a Chinese, okay, and I don't want the PRC to tell people that I'm doing this. Okay, I'm getting money, I'm being paid for the Tibetans, I'm paid for the Indians, I'm paid for the Americans. Okay, to do this. Okay, I'm doing it just as hobby. So, if you want to organize a talk for me, I'll think about it, because every year I set aside part of my income, okay, for doing this, okay, and when my annual budget is depleted, then I'll say I can't come, okay. So if you invite me to come in April when my fund is not depleted, I'll pay for the airfare, I'll pay for everything. As I say, all you have to do is to pay for my lunch. The material that I'm using today is actually from a book that will come out next week, which again, I don't receive any royalty, and all the proceeds of the sale of that book will be donated to Tibetan schools for children. Unfortunately, that book is all in Chinese. Okay, the purpose is to address really my target audience is Chinese, not to Indians, not to Tibetans. And the title of the book is "Tibet Was Never Part of China Since Antiquity." So that's an introduction. The scope of this talk would be, first of all, I'm going to cover some basic concepts. And then after that, a very important part would be to talk about Chinese historiography. And I beg you to be patient with me, because we need to have a solid background of basic Chinese historiography before we can proceed and talk about the Tibet-Chinese sort of the argument, as you would say. But anyway, after that, the primary objective would be, number one, to see whether Tibet was part of China during the Ming Dynasty, and then part B, which will be tomorrow, we'll talk about whether Tibet was independent of China during the Qing Dynasty. So it'll be basically today, we'll talk about the Ming Dynasty, and tomorrow we'll talk about Qing Dynasty, but today we'll also talk a little bit more about basic Chinese historiography. Before I continue, may I ask one question? How many of you can read Chinese? One, two, three. Only three. Okay. I really depend on you, because you need to tell me where I go wrong, okay? But seriously, this question is just so debatable and so controversial that you need to check every word, okay? And so call me out. You might say, hey, you're lying. You're translating the Chinese incorrectly. Let the audience know and let me know, okay? Point out immediately. Point out my mistakes, okay? We have actually, I think that there are two people over here that stand out in this room. Myself, I thought I'll be the only Chinese in the room. I think there's another Chinese in the room too. So I really depend on the other Chinese in the room to point out any errors that I'm making, okay? To make sure that when I'm doing the translation, I'm not faking anything. It's just so much fabrication, and it's just so much faking in this field that you have to watch every word, okay? Anyway, so why are we talking about this topic to begin with? Okay, who cares whether Tibet was part of China in ancient time? Okay, we're only interested in the present, right? Well, not really. It's because the PRC insists on talking about history. The PRC justification for refusing to negotiate with the Tibetans is that the Dalai Lama refuses to admit that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. So both sides insist on something that's irreconcilable. And then, of course, the PRC claims that Tibet is being unified, okay, and not invaded, and it's because, well, Tibet has always been part of China. Therefore, the 1950 military action is not an invasion or occupation, but it's a reunification of Tibet into the old motherland. Now, for those of you interested in going into details, the official statement of the PRC, the most official statement is given by this white paper, which is called Tibet, its ownership and human rights situation. It's white paper, information office of the State Council of PRC. And of course, you can get it from the internet, both in the Chinese version and the English version. And there are, of course, other subsequent white papers on the same topic, which, of course, if you're interested, you should first look at the PRC's position and how they have sort of stated their arguments. So this is one example of the PRC presents their position, and that's how Chinese children are taught in China. Okay, very unfortunately, the reason why I think in this world we have such irreconcilable differences is because your father tells you one side of the story, and then my father tells me my side of the story, and your father's version is just so different. Actually, it's not very different. It's just totally contradictory. Your father's version is totally different, opposite to my father's version, and we never actually occurred to us that, is there another side of the story? Okay, it never occurred that way, okay? So over here, let's look at what the Chinese teach their own people, okay? So the Minister of United Front, which is the name is Suta, which is this is incidentally the PRC official news website, okay? So stated the following during the National Press Conference. The fundamental political basis for contact and negotiation with the Tibetans is recognizing that Tibet has been an inseparable part of China since antiquity. The Dalai Lama has consistently refused to educate himself seriously and correctly on such a fundamental issue. At the July meeting, the lack of honesty and sincerity of the Dalai Lama's faction has again destroyed the atmosphere of the meeting. Okay? Further, you see that goes on. The Dalai Lama faction repeatedly refused to admit that Tibet has been an inseparable part of China since antiquity. From 2002 to the most recent meeting, we have conferred with the Dalai Lamas, with Dalai. Actually, pardon me, this is the straight quotation, okay? So actually, the Chinese simply call the Dalai Lama Dalai, okay? Which, of course, is very rude to the Tibetans, but I'm just giving you the original version, okay? With Dalai's personal representative 9 times, each time they have indicated that they do not agree that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. So this is just an example of thousands of similar statements that are taught in schools and whatever. Of course, the implication, of course, is obviously, the Tibetan side is just lying or they're not recognizing the truth. So, but why does the PRC insist on something that's so seemingly obscure and academic? Who cares about history? Well, the reason is this, is that China is a signatory to, first of all, the League of Nations Covenant in 1980, and then the United Nations Charter in 1945. Both documents prohibit future means post-1918, territorial acquisition via conquest, which is very strange. We now actually have a world where all the countries agree actually that all the conquests and all the occupations before 1918 is okay? But after 1918, all these countries got together and they promised that in future, no more conquest, okay? Moreover, of course, the PRC, if anybody who knows anything about the way Chinese people like us were taught when we were children, okay, by our education material, is that we were told endlessly, incessantly, that this is this sorry picture of China being a victim of Japan and the Western colonial powers, how the Chinese were being bullied, okay? And then, of course, we also condemns the powers, the Japanese and then the Western powers for whatever they have done to the other countries, including, of course, India and so forth, okay? And, of course, China is also a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So they cannot say that, oh, I don't want to accept these things, okay? I mean, they are is a permanent member. And so that's the reason why they have to say that the occupation of Tibet is the reunification of an old territory they cannot say that, oh, in 1950 we just conquered Tibet. See, a lot of patriotic Chinese are aware of that, and so actually you would talk to a lot of so-called patriotic Chinese. They are very proud to say, so what's wrong? In 1950 we conquered Tibet fair and square, and everybody conquers everybody else. Okay, look at what the British did to India, for example. Look at what the Europeans did to the whole American continent. And the truth is, well, you could do that, okay, but that was 300 years ago, but you can't do that after 1918. It's very much like as a Chinese over here, I can tell people that, my great-grandfather, he had 4 wives or 5 concubines, okay, but if I tell somebody that I have 4 wives and 5 concubines today, I'll be in trouble because, no, not today. So that's basically the reason why the PRC has to claim that Tibet was already part of China before the what you call liberation or invasion of Tibet in 1950. So, but what is antiquity, by the way? Okay, China says Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. What on earth do you mean by antiquity? Well, they used to say that it's since Tang Dynasty, which is about 7th century, okay? All people like us, we are brought up to know the story of Wencheng Gongzu, the Princess Wencheng, and blah, 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 and so forth. Now, eventually, even the Chinese communists themselves, they realized that this is a little bit ridiculous, okay? So they actually, they revised it. So the most current version, the claim of the PRC is that Tibet became part of China since the Yuan Dynasty. They move it forward by about 700 years, by the way, from the 7th century to about the 12th century. So, since the PRC says that Tibet became part of China since the Yuan Dynasty, so what I am doing is to look at, starting from Yuan Dynasty, is that to look at the Chinese official records and to see whether they show that Tibet was indeed part of China during the Yuan, which is, of course, since Yuan Dynasty, right? So it's the Yuan Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, and the Republic of China. Now, after 1949, there's nothing to talk about. Tibet, in fact, became part of China, okay? The question, of course, was it invaded, was it occupied, or was it united? Well, that's a question, but there's no point talking about anything after 1949, so I limit myself only to the history over here. Now, so for those of you who are not very familiar with Chinese history, please just remember these few names, Yuan, Ming, Qing, and the Republic of China, and then today we'll talk about Ming, and then tomorrow we'll talk about Qing. And these are the 2 most important dynasties when it comes to whether Tibet was part of China. Incidentally, today when I talk about Tibet, I imply what's today called the Tibet Autonomous Region. We are not talking about the more murky issues that involve the Tibetan regions in Qinghai, and Sichuan, and Yunnan, and Gansu, and so forth. Okay, and that is the limitation that I impose on myself so that I can focus on my research, okay, because the issues of all these different polities outside what is today the Tibet Autonomous Region is a lot more complicated, okay? So, I think given the audience, I can skip that. I think everybody over here knows about the recent history about what happened in 1950 and the years before that. So I'm going to skip that part. And then, okay, so I have, this is the scope and objectives, and I have just completed this part, the importance of the topic. So the next thing that I'm going to go over will be the initial motivation, and then about the guiding principles of my research. So let's look at the initial motivation. Those of you who can read Chinese, this is Chinese submission to the imperial court. And there are 3 of you who can read that, and I'm going to ask you, what dynasty or what era is it from? Which emperor is it from? Okay, for the benefit of those who can read Chinese, 嗣德35年12月21日，清奉御准，承范圣爵，充为钦差正使，陈阮述充为钦差。 副使. Do you know which dynasty that's from? Guess? It's Qing. I cheated you. Okay? I misled you. This is not a Chinese document. This is from Vietnam. Okay, and this is year 1883. This is year 1883 after Vietnam became a protectorate of France. After China fought with France, and again, who won and who lost depends on which side of the story you're reading about, but the end result is that Vietnam became a protectorate of France. They were still using fully Chinese script. I have asked Chinese, and no Chinese had ever detected that this is a non-Chinese document. My point is that there are countries in surrounding China, they were using Chinese, okay, as the official language, as the scholastic language for centuries, okay? You cannot tell the difference. You cannot tell the difference between a Chinese document and basically a Vietnamese document because they use the same language, okay? So this is 1883, okay? And this, of course, is a photocopy of a real document that's preserved in Vietnam right now, by the way, okay? And this is 1884, okay, same thing, okay? So my point is this, actually. Again, I am going to ask for the help of those of you who can read Chinese, okay? You look at Chinese language, you look at Japan. This is Japan. The difference between human beings and animals, the biggest difference is that we have written language. Because animals have spoken language too. The whales and the elephants, okay, they talk among themselves, okay? But the human beings, the civilized human beings, we have written language. And the most important part of your written language is one, how you identify yourself. What do you call yourself, okay? And if you look at Japan, okay, I don't know whether you realize that Japan, Nippon, okay, means the place where the sun rises, okay? It sounds very, very gorgeous. It sounds very impressive. But if you think about it, the place where the sun rises is east. East where the sun rises is east to the center of China. The very name Nippon, Japan, okay, betrays this recognition that the center is China, okay? And you look at the names for the Ministry of Education, the Bank of Japan, Nippon, all Nippon Airlines, all these things, they're exactly like Chinese words. In fact, okay, the meaning is the same, the writing is the same, everything is the same. If you look at Vietnam, okay, Vietnam means the south. In the Vietnamese language and the Chinese language, it means the south of the Viet part of China, and the Yue part is actually today's Guangdong, which is the province where my ancestors come from. In other words, Vietnam, in brief, means the south of China, okay? And actually, the original name of Vietnam is actually called An Nan, which is peace at the south. So these are examples of countries where no doubt they have this very, very close linkage or lineage, okay, with China. But if you look at Japan, Japan wanted to become the brothers of the Chinese during the Second World War, okay, and the Chinese, of course, got very mad. See, who wants to be your brother? Okay, you murdered so many of my brothers and sisters and confederates, and I'm not your brother, okay? So the Chinese don't want these people as their brothers. On the other hand, Chinese wouldn't dare to call Vietnam as the whatever the past protectorate. But the relationship is obvious, okay? You look at the Germanic countries, for example, okay, the Netherlands, Holland, okay? They call themselves, this is the name they call themselves, Nederland, okay? And actually the German word is Nederlande, okay? And the only difference is that there's an I over here and the E over here, and Nederlande in German means lowlands, okay? The Netherlands is the lowlands compared or with reference to the main part of Germany. Österreich, Austria, their own name, Austria is the English name, but the Austrians call them Österreich, and in German it means the Eastern Kingdom, okay? Austria is east of Germany. Denmark, actually their own name is called Danmark, and Mark, the word Mark is actually borderland in German, and so Denmark actually means that our country is the borderland country of Germany. So it all betrays again the fact that they were all actually one culture and one country. But remember, when Hitler tried to unite these countries into one big Aryan nation, Hitler was considered as a real crook and devil, right? Okay, you look at this thing, okay? this is what the Tibetans call themselves. Okay, and the Chinese, we joke about the fact that these Western lettering, okay, the English alphabets, they look like earthworms. But you look at that, my goodness, it doesn't look like earthworms. It doesn't look like beetles. I don't know what they look like. Okay, most Chinese don't even know a single letter of the Tibetan language, let alone a single word. So if you have these people that cannot be considered as the brothers of Chinese, if you look at these people that shouldn't be united in one country, well, I mean, somebody with this kind of a name for themselves, okay, which is just totally unrelated to the Chinese language, then how could they have been part of China since antiquity? You need to explain it. If this were true, is that how come they could preserve something like that for, the past 1,000 years or whatever as the case may be? So that's actually one of the motivation of trying to find out. I mean, why? Okay, so right now let's come back to the main question, and that is, was Tibet part of China during the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty, as the case may be? Here, let's start with something simple. Suppose if you want to find out my nationality, you ask me, okay? Why do you just ask me, what's your nationality? And if I say, I'm an American, that answers your question. However, suppose you have reason to doubt my honesty, and you want me to prove that I'm an American, what would be the most straightforward proof? Very good, a passport, right? Take my passport. Now, if I show you my driving license, well, it's 50%. If I show you my college diploma, well, if I show you a picture I've taken with Donald Trump, hey, I've taken a picture with Donald Trump, that proves I'm American. You know immediately that I am a con man, right? Right? Okay, so the same thing over here. Was Tibet part of China in, let's say, any year, any dynasty? How do we prove it? What criteria? Just like, American means a passport, right? Okay, and a photo with Donald Trump doesn't count. How would we prove or disprove that Tibet was or wasn't part of China? What criteria would come to mind? When you rule a place, when you conquer a place, what was the main reason for doing that? What? Culture? We are too high class. If you look at people like Genghis Khan, the Manchurians, or most people, or even Hitler, I don't think they did any conquering because of culture. Well, Hitler ended up looting a lot of paintings. Okay, that's for sure. Exploitation, and what's the most standard form of exploitation? Taxes. That's right? First thing is that, did you collect tax in that place? Were you able to collect tax? But there's actually one thing that goes before collecting tax. You know what that is? How could you collect tax? What makes it possible? You need the tax rolls, right? You need census records, okay? And how many of you celebrate Christmas? Most of you are not Christians, but do you know about the Christmas story? Yeah, why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? I use this example not for Indians, but for when I give the speech to the Westerners. But really, the Westerners would know very well. Jesus was born in Bethlehem because his father was asked to report to his hometown, because at that time the Roman emperor ordered all the subjects, okay, to be counted, okay, in their own hometowns. But that's true in China, in every place, all the empires, okay, the first thing to do is to have a census, and then based on the tax rolls, they started collecting money from you, okay? So, but there are many other criteria, okay? So let's look at some of the criteria. So this will be an example, right? The first one would be like the American question. Why do you just ask me, what is my nationality? And if I tell you that I'm American, then probably I am. On the other hand, if I tell that I'm not American, then probably I'm not, okay? This is what you call the self-declaration criterion, and that is, how do I call myself? Do I call myself an American, or do I call myself a Canadian, okay? Then that's how the Chinese government, they have labeled themselves, okay, and how they have labeled Tibet. Okay, and then the second one would be census and residency registration, which is the criterion that I've just mentioned. And then taxation, tributes, okay? and then a whole bunch of other things, for example. Did you send judges there? Did they follow the same laws? And then, of course, do they use the same languages and so forth? Now, among those criteria, if you dissatisfied or not satisfy any of those, that doesn't conclusively prove that you are or you're not part of China. On the other hand, if you have a region that didn't satisfy any of these criteria, then it's pretty clear that place wasn't part of China. And actually, what I have found, of course, is that in those dynasties, okay, Yuan, Ming, Qing, and the Republic of China, Tibet satisfied none of these. And you'll be surprised, okay, when you look at the old records, because the tributes actually is one thing that the PRC sort of brags about all the time. And we'll actually see what tributes mean in the old records. So anyway, we'll then also look at individual events and to examine whether China had any sort of real influence over Tibet. So, the second guiding principle that I use in my research, okay, remember the first guiding principle is I use reasonable criteria, okay? In other words, do you have text rows? Do you have languages? Do you collect texts and so forth? The second one is this. I take 100% Chinese chauvinistic approach in my research. In other words, my approach is that why should I listen to the Tibetans? Why should I listen to the Indians or the British for that matter? Okay, they all write this nonsense about Tibet anyway. So I only look at documents that are written in the Chinese language, Hanyu, okay, by Chinese as defined by the PRC, which includes, of course, not only the Hans, but the Manchurians and, of course, some of the Mongolian officers in the Yuan court. Okay? As you know, the Qing dynasty was basically a Manchurian dynasty, and then, of course, the Yuan dynasty was the Mongolian dynasty. Okay? And then on top of that, not only that they have been written by Chinese, they were published in China sometime between the beginning of the Yuan dynasty, which is 1279, and the beginning of the PRC, it's 1949. In other words, we're going to say, okay, I'm not going to not listen to what the Chinese communists have to say, but I'm going to listen to what all the Chinese that preceded the Chinese communists, what they say. So it'll be between 1279 and 1948. It's just been published, open for inspection. Overwhelming majority of these documents have been republished and reprinted by the PRC after 1949. In other words, these are documents that have been written by the Chinese before 1949, but they have been reaffirmed and recognized by the PRC as authoritative. Okay, so I'm looking at these documents. Okay, because as I've said, my objective is to try to explain to the Chinese that hey, according to your own documents, let's see what they say. Okay, regardless of what the Westerners, the Indians, or the Tibetans, what they say. And then on top of that, of course, to make it easier for you to check the accuracy, the majority of these documents are available for examination via internet websites, either operated by the PRC institutions or approved and supported by the PRC government. So I'm using documents that are not only recognized as valid and authoritative by the PRC, but the addition are also printed by the PRC, okay? So there's no way I can fake it. In other words, it's a simple statement. Don't believe in a single word I say. Check it out. Unfortunately, of course, I'm speaking to an audience where most of you can't read Chinese, so you can't accept my challenge. But when I make a presentation in Chinese, I would say, check out every word I say, okay? In your case, okay, you need to take some Chinese lessons, okay? I'm just joking. The next thing that I'll do is to go through, and this part, please be patient with me because you really need to understand this part in order to go forward. And that you need to know something about what's called Chinese historiography. In other words, what these historical documents are. Okay, why is this important? If you study Pythagoras' theorem when you were in high school, okay, a squared plus b squared plus c squared equals to c squared, and you have other scientific concepts. It's not important to know actually who invented them. Okay, so I don't care whether it's Pythagoras or anybody. It could be some Chinese or some Europeans who came up with a squared plus b squared equals to c squared. The source is not important because I can prove it or disprove it as the case may be. I can test it empirically today. Okay, now history is different. History is that we have to depend on records. Whose records do I believe in? Okay, particularly in the case of Tibet history, because the Tibetan records apparently are different from the Chinese records. Is that true? I don't know. That's what we're going to find out. But the first thing we ask when somebody tells you something about Tibetan Chinese history is that, where do you read it from? Now, if you read it from the PRC's People's Daily, or to before for that matter, if you read it from the Dalai Lama website, it's probably not that, I mean, look, let's be very fair about it, right? Let's find something that is sort of neutral, okay? And then we'll then judge and see whether they are accurate. Okay, so I am taking the chauvinistic approach by claiming that the Chinese classical documents are reliable and credible. Now, why am I saying that? Not entirely because I'm chauvinistic, but there's really a reason behind it. China is actually the only old culture that has a system of what you call official history, which is correct history. In Chinese, it's called Census. First of all, the primary sources. When the emperor gets up and then goes to work, whole imperial court, we have what is called the daily records. Literally in Chinese, qi ji zhu means rising and living records. The moment the emperor rises from the bed, okay, the whole day, everything recorded, including all the imperial court proceedings. And then, please look at this, because this one will be used repeatedly, okay? The importance of this, because these daily records will be kept for the reign of one emperor, and after the death of each emperor, the succeeding emperor, usually the son or the niece or whatever, or the nephew, whatever, will then convene a board and look at all the daily records and then compile the veritable records, 实录 of the emperor. So each emperor, after the death, will have a set of veritable records, okay? And we now actually have a complete set of all the emperors for the Ming and the Qing dynasty. For the Yuan dynasty, we don't have a complete set sort of existing, but Ming and Qing we do have. And then, of course, on top of that, we have other primary sources. We have these reports or submissions from the officials, okay? And then the imperial edicts, and these are all kept, and they are all digitized, and you can all search them from the websites, okay? They are operated by the People's Republic of China. And none of these things can be faked because there are multiple copies of that kept in different libraries, on top of the fact that they are available in websites that are searchable. So these are what you call the primary sources, okay? And then that comes a semi-primary source, which comes to the history, official history. This is not official history yet. These are raw material primary sources. And then from these primary sources, we get the semi-primary sources, which is called the official history, or the 24 histories. And they're all together, actually 24, 25, depending on how you count. And goes back, the first one goes back to more than 2,000 years ago, and that is the historical records of the Western Han dynasty. For our research and for our talks in the next 2 days, we'll be only looking about this, Ming history and Qing history draft. Now, the way these things are compiled is this. Remember, we say, after the death of each emperor, the successor will compile the veritable records. And after the demise of each dynasty, the succeeding dynasty will again convene a board of scholars and then go through all the archival records, and particularly the veritable records, and then compile the official history of the dynasty. So that would mean that the Yuan history was actually compiled after the demise of the Yuan dynasty by the Ming government, and Ming history, of course, is also then compiled after the demise of the Ming dynasty by the Qing emperors. But this is a tradition that has been followed by these Chinese historians, official historians, for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Okay, so it's a very, very formal system of keeping these records, and these people were educated before 1949, which is very important because after 1949, people are taught that for political reasons, you can say whatever you like, okay, to fit political goals, okay. the Chinese before 1949, they were not taught that way. They were taught that if you're a historian, you stick to the truth, okay, you fight for the truth with your life. And they were actually people known, okay, to have their head chopped off because they refused to obey what the emperors wanted them to write down, okay? So these things, and you see the content later on when I look at these records, you see, my goodness, they have all these dirty linens washed out, okay? If you look at most of these records, okay, of most cultures is that the kings or the leaders are all saints, they can do no wrong, okay? But if you look at these Chinese officials' histories, okay, they reveal just so much sort of scandals that you will know that they are true, okay, because nobody will make these things up, okay? And you'll see some of the examples afterwards, by the way. And so this is just a listing of the way you can actually go to these sources and read them yourselves, if you can read Chinese, and that is. Some of them, they're actually operated jointly by the Chinese government and the American government. Okay, this is called China-American Digital Academic Libraries. Okay, so and then of course these are the important databases. It contains hundreds of thousands of books, classic books that digitized. Now, for background information, for non-controversial information, I'm going to use Baidu again because of my audience. Remember, my target audience is the Chinese. Is that Wikipedia is not available in China. Okay, so in order to convince the Chinese who live in mainland China, because in China instead of Wikipedia, the PRC have Baidu available. Okay, so people read Baidu. Okay, except of course Wikipedia is sort of free. Free not in the sense of the cost, but in terms of freedom of speech. Baidu, of course, is basically, it represents the PRC's point of view, which is good. That's the whole idea, is that we want everything to conform to the PRC's point of view, as that according to what they say, how do we look at Tibet history? So we use Baidu as the authoritative source, okay? And for background information, actually, it's okay, because for most background information, nobody would lie. Okay. So I'm going to skip through that because, and these are just examples of other sort of a series of books, okay, that would give you access to all the authoritative material and so forth. Okay, so I am done with the first part, which is the first slide. I've been crossed out.